Thank you for coming out tonight. It's Seattle Kubernetes Meetup. This is the largest number of people I think I've ever seen in this room for this particular meetup. I'm used to this corner being taken. But again, thank you guys for coming out to the meetup tonight. Hope you guys are all going to be in town for KubeCon tomorrow. That should be awesome. We got some good speakers tonight. We're going to do, this is the first time I've done this type of format. We're going to do a roundtable where I have some questions. I'm just going to start asking these guys. I don't believe any of these guys need to be introduced to the audience.
Do it anyway.
Actually, let them introduce themselves.
Let's see, can you hear me? Is this working? Check. There we go. I'm Beda, and I'm one of the guys that helped get Kubernetes started. And I left Google about 1.5 years ago, and I'm finally figuring out soon what I'm going to be doing with myself.
Hey, I'm Craig. I'm a product guy. I worked on the Kubernetes project in the early days. As soon as Beda figures out what he's going to be doing, I'll know myself.
I'm Brendan Burns, and I think, I guess that's about all I'll say. Thank you for coming to Seattle, because it's my hometown, and it makes me very happy to have you all here, so thanks.
Hi, I'm Tim Hockin. I'm one of the early hangers-on to the Kubernetes project, and I'm up from California, so this weather is actually really nice.
It's still shorts weather.
It's shorts weather here, too.
So I'm going to ask some questions just to kind of get things going, and then what we're going to do is also turn it over to you guys to ask whatever questions you might want to ask one of these guys, or all of them. How's that sound to you guys? Sound cool? So my first one, it's going to be an easy one. So we've been hearing the phrase cloud native application. What is that? Can you define that for? What's the difference between that and what we've been building for the last year?
So one of the things I was saying, Craig is the one who probably first told me this term, I think, but one of the things I always said is that when you look at the traditional cloud landscape, it's really just sort of Dell, but better, right? You know, you can get a machine and you get it instantly or in a minute or two, and when you give it back, you only pay for the time you used it. But it doesn't really fundamentally change the way you build stuff. It doesn't really make it easier to build systems. It doesn't make it easier to build reliable systems. And I think when we start talking about cloud native, we're sort of starting to talk about the things that are taking advantage of the unique aspects of being in the cloud. Things like elasticity, like the fact that you can build these abstractions that don't actually really exist at some level, and then just rely on them. I think that's probably what I would say. I don't know, that's probably a bad answer.
Maybe I can take a crack at this as the product guy. So, you know, there's a kind of trite definition that I've pulled into. You guys can hear me? I can actually speak pretty loud.
It's streaming too. You want to be
All right, I'll try to get up there.
Yeah.
So there's a relatively trite definition, which is, hey, cloud native is container packaged, dynamically scheduled, microservices oriented. But that's not really the heart of it. You know, when I look at cloud native, it's in many ways inspired by the cloud companies, like building software that's inspired by the cloud companies. You know, when I look at the people who are, you know, truly succeeding in cloud, there's really, you know, big three, right? You have Amazon. They got there first. They learned to operate at scale, and they created a set of patterns that let them create more agile systems and run their operations in more agile form. You look at people like Google. Google had always been in the cloud. Like it's actually been hard for Google to become more of an enterprise company, and it's been working really hard to do that. You look at Microsoft. Microsoft learned to be a cloud company by building Bing, by building the Xbox Live capabilities, and by operating at scale. And the reality is that when you operate at scale, you learn a set of practices. You learn to design and architect and deliver your technology in a more services-oriented fashion. You stop thinking about product that gets thrown over the wall. You start thinking about delivering it as a service to other folks. And so what I think about cloud native is really extracting a lot of the patterns that were born in the internet domain, that were born in the companies that are operating at the sort of, you know, the cloud scale, and bringing it, you know, back to earth, you know, bringing it to the enterprise to solve real problems, creating far more efficient, composite, composable systems, creating a new class of operations model that's really inspired by the cloud approach, but made relevant to enterprises everywhere. That's a long answer.
I can't top that.
He gets good at this because he doesn't have to write code.
I did cut that part of my brain out so I could open my mouth wider.
So to me, I'll be short. To me, cloud native is about how you design the software. It's online all the time. It's live updates. It's nothing's boxed. It's everything's designed to scale. Everything's designed to fail. Network centric, service centric. This idea that no one anything matters is really what cloud native means to me.
So I think the only thing I'd add is there's an aspect of operability around here. Cloud native software is meant to be operated both by humans and by systems. And over time, you learn from outages and mistakes and postmortems, and you feed that back into the product design. So there's a certain amount of cloud native where cloud native software is never done, right? I mean, all good software is never done, but it's always a work in progress, and you're always applying your learnings to the system as it evolves.
Cool, thank you. And so one of the things I've been watching in the CNCF on the technical committees is more and more projects being proposed to the CNCF. Do you feel that there might be a danger that too many projects get placed into the CNCF that are losing the focus on its core project, Kubernetes?
Maybe I can answer this. So let's be clear. Like, CNCF isn't a Kubernetes foundation, right? Like, in many ways, I worked with Linux Foundation and a lot of our friends in industry to stand up CNCF as a home for Kubernetes. But it was never intended to be a Kubernetes foundation. It was never intended to be monopolized by the Kubernetes project. It was intended to be a safe foundation that would allow the industry to rally around this cloud-native approach, this new way of building software, and safely create in a vendor-neutral way a new class of technologies. And I actually think it's incredibly heartening to see a new wealth of technologies emerging to CNCF. I think it is important that those technologies remain focused on that core mission, cloud-native, container package, dynamic schedule, microservice-oriented, as a sort of acid test, with some of the operations components and really leveraging out the best that cloud has to offer. But I am definitely heartened by this, and I would love to see more projects show up in CNCF. I don't think we need to constrain ourselves to Kubernetes. There's a lot of other good orchestration technologies. And what I'd like to see is that becoming a great home where the community can rally around these technologies, where end users can engage with the community and actually make it their own, and where it has a real sense of technical identity that's being driven by a non-partisan, vendor-neutral technical oversight committee. So I'm really heartened by it. I'm not worried about it at all.
Yeah.
So my next question is about Docker. So a few months ago, there was an internet Twitter thing that happened about Solomon, the OCI, Docker, and then there was calls for a Docker fork. What's your guys' take on the Docker fork, and where do you sit?
I can answer that. I think it's a terrible idea. Straight up, it's a terrible idea, right? Craig talked a lot about containers. I think we're all here because we believe that this is a sea change. This is a moment where computing is changing. But there's people out there, quite a number of people out there who are not financially incentivized to see that transition happen quickly. And a lot of traditional vendors of IT. And the more you give opportunity for there to be FUD, you just reincarnate the Linux FreeBSD war. And I think that probably set back Linux adoption by 3, 4, 5 years. It was a bad thing and a stupid thing. And I just don't see any value in it. I think the concerns are real. I think that production hygiene is very, very important, and so that a lot of the concerns that are raised are necessary concerns. But I don't know. I feel like it's a distraction and an opportunity for the people who don't want to see containers move forward to just say like, well, maybe you should wait a couple of years. They're still figuring that whole thing out. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting. I mean I'm kind of sort of been observing this for a while. And when I look back, right in the early days of Kubernetes, like Joe and I started thinking about some of this stuff way back when, in terms of the container space, and then Brennan sort of helped us really ground it in an orchestration story. And right from the get-go, we decided that we want to support Docker. Spent a lot of time agonizing over that decision. We had Let Me Contain That For You. It was a new
Tim,
Tim,
one of the main authors on that.
It was, and frankly, it was better technology. Like Let Me Contain That For You was just simply better technology. But Docker had done something really neat. They kind of figured out the developer experience story. They'd identified, first of all, that the Linux syscall layer was fantastically stable. It let you, create this sort of application level or OS level virtualization that was missing previously. And then they recognized the value of the overlay file system as a way to actually create and share and compose images. And then finally, and most importantly, they just created a magic developer experience. So it was a fantastic technology. And I'm really glad that as a community we rallied behind Docker and we continue to support it. And I think that as a result of that, we got to the point that we're at today, which is fantastic. Now, when I look to the future, there's some things that worry me, right? First of all, focusing on container is somewhat of a misnomer. Like, container is just one piece of technology in this big cloud-native portfolio of technologies. The container environment, the container format, the container runtime, et cetera, is just one small piece of it. So what I would say is I'm a huge fan of standardization around the container image. I think it's absolutely essential that as a community, we establish that container image as the standard that connects the world of developer tooling that lets you build and package and distribute software from the runtime environment, the world where you are able to actually deploy and manage the software in whatever clustering technology makes sense to you, right? So I love that format. The challenge that I've seen so far with Docker is that they've inextricably linked the format to the runtime environment. And it's been almost impossible to separate those two things out. As a community, we got behind OCI. So when we were sort of standing up CNCF, Docker stood up the OCI initiative, which we all supported. Microsoft, Google, everyone supported OCI as a way to create a standard container image distribution. The reality is that it never materialized. OCI never became the thing we were looking for. It only it became a way to think about mapping an image onto disk, and it was it really didn't hit the thing that we needed, which was the standard interface between the world of developer tooling and the world of operations. And so at the end of the day, I'm not supportive of a Docker fork. I actually don't think that it's the right way for the community to go. What I am supportive of is getting to a point where we have a simple, accessible, standard format that can run in multiple environments, where different people can build better classes of software runtime environment that are more stable, more efficient, more performant, more secure, whatever it is. But as a community, we have to have an image standard, and we're just not getting it. And so, I would definitely call for the community to continue to push on getting a standard distributable image format that separates those two worlds. I think it's just essential for the health of the community. And I'm hopeful that Docker will get there. Like I'm continue to be optimistic that they will get there. But I would say that the time is running out. We really need this thing pretty soon.
So, just to put another fine point on it, Brennan mentioned that the concerns are real. And I just want to be specific about that. I think one of the concerns is the standard image packaging format. Another concern is just one of stability and production hygiene. There is no long-term stable version of Docker that's available to everybody. And that creates problems for folks who are building on top of Docker. It's very, very difficult when the new version fixes old bugs but introduces new ones, and nobody's backporting and supporting a long-term stable version. And then the second concern is that the release of Swarm built into Docker just smelled bad to a lot of people. Like, a lot of people looked at it and said, why are we building this monolithic world when the Unix philosophy is to actually break these things up so that they are actually independently useful. And so that abandonment of this sort of that model for this sort of integrated integrated stack, I think just didn't sit right with a lot of folks.
So I'll mostly echo what everybody else said. The chatter about a fork and all the grumbles are real. They're very real. There's been many articles and blog posts about people who have real problems with Docker and running it day to day. We've had our share of those problems, and I completely agree that these problems need to be resolved. The thing is, and I'll borrow a phrase, I think it was Joe or maybe Bob who coined it, but like software at this level of the stack is boring. Right? It should not be exciting. And if you're getting excited about the container runtime, something is wrong. And so, everybody loves a good drama. So we're watching this play out, but really I think the best outcome here is not a Docker fork, because nobody wants to do that. And that's a lot of weight to carry and a lot of just blowback to deal with for no real win. It's just not that exciting. So I think that there are better answers. I hope that we can find them and that we can get everybody on the same page is really it. But that said, the technology at this level is also not that complicated. And so if we need to go our own way at some point, that's on the table too. I just hope we don't have to get there because it's boring.
What can Docker do to participate in the community more, though?
They could participate in the community more. I mean, truthfully, I ran this recently because I wasn't sure. There are 0 commits in Kubernetes among 40,000-ish commits. 0 have at docker.com or docker.io. I searched for both.
.cloud. No, actually, I'm pretty confident. I think you're confident. I'm confident.
I did not look for .cloud. We were doing a lot of stuff that could use Docker's input. I would love to get their feedback on some of the designs that we've got going on. I would love to work with them more on myriad issues. We both have network drivers, they're different. We both have storage drivers, they're different. We both have auth stuff, they're different. We both have orchestration systems, and they're very different. Well, actually not that different.
Getting closer every day.
So I'd love to work with these guys more. I have conversations with them at every conference we go to. They're everywhere. They're smart people. What could they do to participate more? One side would be more receptive. The other side would be more offering in their own time, I guess, a little bit.
I think one of the things that distinguish the Kubernetes community from any other open source community I've seen out there, and sorry, this sounds a little self-congratulating, please forgive me, but it is a legitimately open community. When I look back on the very earliest days of Kubernetes, like Brandon, Joe, and I were down there in San Francisco. We just announced the project, and I was introduced to this guy, Brian Stevens from Red Hat, right? And he came up and he was like, hey, here you're doing this thing, explain it. So we explained what he was doing, and he looked at it and he thought about it, and he's like, okay, Red Hat's all in. I was like, what? They're like, no, we're all in. And there's this guy here, his name's Clayton Coleman, you're gonna really like him, right? And we were like, who's the hell's Clayton Coleman dude? What's he gonna get up to? And so Clayton showed up and he looked through the code and he was like, well, you guys, you're a little liberal with Go coding standards, so maybe I can help you with that. And he stepped in and he actually started helping out. And within a little while, he was part of the team. And it was an equal owner, and he was on the highest levels of access, and he was central to a lot of the design discussions. And by the time we'd ship 1.0, Red Hat had written 25% of the code base, and they had an equal stake in this community. And at the end of the day, when it came time to figure out what to do with Kubernetes, Google donated Kubernetes to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It gave up any specific control of the trademark. Any control of the IP, because to Google it was more important that the project succeed than that Google have deep and sophisticated ties and controls over the project. At the end of the day, Google could do this because Google has a great set of engineers that are just continuing to lean into this community and deliver value. And at the point at which another company is contributing at that level and has actually taken the project further, God bless them. They've actually earned the right to do whatever they want with that technology. That is a very different philosophy around community management than anything we've seen out there in places like Docker. Docker's in a tough spot. They're a startup. They have to justify a spectacular valuation. And at the end of the day, that creates some challenges in terms of creating a legitimately and truly open community. And so, if I was going to give advice to Docker, I'd say, hey, look at what we did with Kubernetes. look at how the community feels about the project. Look at the strength of that community and the velocity that the project has attained as a result of it. And I guarantee you will find a way to profit from that outcome, right? Sometimes holding on to something too hard actually, it just slows it down. And so I think you have to rethink community. And I think one of the things that I love about what's happened here with Kubernetes is that it is by far the most open source community I've ever seen out there. It's not just open source, it's like open community, which is very powerful.
I'd like to see Docker have cleaner lines between Docker open source and Docker Inc. I think that the fact that they have the same name creates a lot of confusion. It's like, what's good for Docker? And it's like, well, which one, right? And I think there's a lot of conflation there. And I think we should call Docker open source DOS. I think that'd be awesome. I'm sorry, the Microsoft person here. No,
You spent way more time there than I have. You wrote Internet Explorer, so
there is that. Yeah.
So over the next few releases, what areas of the Kubernetes project do you think need the most focus?
So there's two areas that I'm particularly strongly interested in. One, which is finally, I think, maybe starting to get some traction, which is third-party resources and extensibility, enabling. It's a shame that we didn't have this earlier. I think because we see places where we've made decisions that I think maybe we could have done more modularly and more flexibly in other places. And I think now we're reaching a place where we really legitimately can say, we're done, or at least we're really close to being done with a number of API objects and everything else needs to start outside the core code base and effectively carry its weight and prove itself, and then we can talk about bringing it in. I think that's hugely important, both because there are people who have specific needs and they should be able to satisfy those things without having to contribute code to us and convince us why it's valuable, and I think it's also important because the core code needs to effectively make sure that it's valuable before it pulls it in. I think along a similar line, we have to figure out how we stop, right? I think we have a lot of expansionist goals in the high level. I mean, I come in and I say things like, we should make Bigtable CS 101, right? Like boil the ocean kind of goals. And I think that when you're inspired like that, you want to build everything and you want to build it all into one system, and it's at this point way more important to know where we stop than it is to know what we should do next. So I don't know, I think that's the thing I'm thinking about a lot.
I think that's a very powerful thing. The hardest thing in software is not knowing what you are, it's knowing what you're not. And figuring out what constitutes core, creating a really clean boundary around that. I think there's some work to be done. Look at what the Chorus guys have done with the operating model recently. It's really interesting stuff, right? There's definitely some interesting stuff to be done. But I think it's more important to just focus on what is core, make sure that is clean, consistent, stable, behind stable interfaces, and then find ways to create natural extensibility around it.
It needs to be boring.
Be boring. Yeah.
Yeah.
Be boring. I look forward to being boring.
Yeah. And I think there's a difference between core and what are all the pieces that make up a useful general purpose Kubernetes cluster. And that's going to be both core and pieces on top of it. And we should come up with some sort of specification conformance test for that. Call it Kubernetes standard base or whatever, level 0, level 1.
Yeah.
I've never heard anything so boring.
It's really boring. Yeah, exactly.
No, but I think
third-party resources are a critical tool for enabling us to move in that direction.
Absolutely.
I think that we're sort of moving past that point where everybody built their own Linux kernel to the point where people started to think about distros, right? And I think that's a good thing. That's a really good thing. But it means that we're working on different things, right?
And there's a lot of work to be done in the, extending the Linux thing in the userland space. There's a ton of application level constructs that can be created and service constructs and extensions. But I think that for this project to get truly adopted and to truly reach its potential, you have to be able to declare the core done at some point in the not too distant future. I'm sorry, Tim, go ahead.
No, I agree with all that. I think we're reaching the place where all the table stakes are met. My big fear right now is that we're still overdriving our headlights a little bit. And it's time to dial back the velocity, make sure that all the things we built actually work the way they're supposed to work in all cases. That includes things like conformance and testing and documentation and examples and says the guy who read the docs.
Try to.
They're better than they used to be.
We actually have docs people now. Praise be to the docs people. So yeah, I agree that we need to get a little bit more boring, slow it down, draw some boundaries. I think extensibility is a huge deal. I'm on a mission right now to kick Google out of the core code base and make things more modular and even-footed, and to make sure that all the on-prem installations have the same access to all the various APIs that the cloud providers do.
How close are we to that point? To core.
Hopefully we'll know better by the end of the week.
Yeah, we've got the Dev Summit. We've got the Dev Summit later this week, and there's a multi-hour block set aside for arguing about what the definition of core is. There's been a lot of proposed definitions, and I think they're all great, but they're all wrong in some slight way. And so we're going to find the sort of compromised statements that define what we are and what we aren't. I think we've done a good job. We set out some swim lanes early on in the project, and we said we're going to do this, we're not going to do that. But I think we can crystallize that a lot further. So I don't know, dodging the question of when, not too much longer.
We're going to print out all the code and circle the core stuff.
No. The idea that I had was that we were all going to print it out, and then we're going to cut out the parts that we think we should take out. And the place where there's overlap, where you can see through all the pages, that's what we actually take out.
So my next question is about security. There was that TLS verified master kubelet connections being broken bug that got patched. How should we start communicating security issues in Kubernetes to the rest of the community?
I just asked this question. So, I just asked this question of Sarah Novotny. Because of course, and this is actually something that we should think about as a community. So because of course when it was a Google project, Google has a very established path by which security issues enter into Google and then are solved and sorted back out. To my knowledge, Linux Foundation does not have such a path. Obviously, Linux does it? I assume it does.
I imagine Linux is figured this shit out.
I would imagine it has, but I've actually never experienced this, so I don't know.
I think this is a place where
And I think this is a place where we need
CNCF.
Yeah, CNCF probably
value.
is the right place to do this, but we need to figure out what the processes are. And I think going back to Craig's statement about being open and transparent, I really hope that this is a thing that we can leverage the people who are interested in this to come up with what the right answer is. Because I don't think no one benefits from opacity here. Right? So,
No, I think it's great, and
but we need to have the infrastructure. We just don't have the infrastructure.
I'm meeting with. I'm personally happy to raise this with Dan.
Yeah. He's here. I just
He just walked in.
There he is, Dan.
Yeah, Dan, you got this right?
Yeah. So the Linux Foundation has the Linux project is a great process. CNCF doesn't yet. And so
Okay.
we need it.
Yeah.
We're gonna need to figure it out.
We'll get Alexis right on that.
All right.
How do you see the ecosystem growing? How do you see the ecosystem growing across 2017?
Wow. Okay.
Do you see more investment coming in?
So sorry. Okay. Let's just taxonomize the ecosystem. There's obviously the cloud providers, and as we've observed, I think that there will be ubiquity that every cloud provider will have a hosted and managed Kubernetes system.
We got 2 out of 3.
We got 2 out of 3. I expect that we'll see Amazon follow suit. They've always been very transparent with the fact that as their customers demand it, they will provide it. And there's a pretty decent demand for Kubernetes right now. I imagine IBM and some of the others will also provide this. So that's one component of it. We're seeing obviously an amazing level of adoption with a lot of the traditional software providers. VMware has created a Kubernetes sort of story, and I expect to see a decent proliferation of Kubernetes-based offerings that are tied to a lot of vendor-specific projects. I think the thing that's going to be most interesting to observe, and I have aspirations that this is going to happen, is to watch the ISV, the software vendor community, start to look at Kubernetes as a standard basis for distributed system deployments and operations. So, hey, I'm a business intelligence provider and I have some kind of BI suite. A lot more of them are going to start looking at Kubernetes as a natural place to actually deploy their software. So we're going to start to see a lot more of the software vendors looking at Kubernetes as a standard basis, and I expect that a lot of deployment steps will start with get a Kubernetes installation working using some, well understood distro and work from there. So that's the next piece of it, and then I think that the final piece is that there's going to be obviously a lot of energy in the startup community. Like we're seeing, I've personally over the last month met I think 4 or 5 different startups that are helping to make Kubernetes accessible to the broader community. And so I think we'll start to see a lot more energy and focus there. And I actually think it's really good for the community. At the end of the day, we're seeing a $3 billion OpenStack community starting to question what's next. Like, where do we go from here? People are already struggling with OpenStack. And we're seeing the most successful OpenStack deployments actually running on Kubernetes. We're starting to see the middleware industry question their existence, and Kubernetes is a viable alternative. And so I think it's nothing but up from here, and we're likely to see significant innovation at almost every level of the ecosystem. Systems integrators, trainers, startups, traditional vendors, cloud, ISVs, you name it. I think we're going to see a really strong engagement in the community.
I really want to see ecosystem growth in the SI space, the system integrators in particular. We get every week some big enterprise who wants to run Kubernetes, but they need help. And Google's not in a position where we can really do, enterprise support. And so we're looking for more SIs there. I think that's going to be a place where things really start to go nuts. And I think also in the integration points with the various enterprise hardware and software systems, the networking and the storage and the auth, and these sorts of things, I think this is going to be a place where we really boom next year.
So I think the one other place that I'm interested in and excited about is in the space of sort of patterns of how you use this thing, developer patterns and application system patterns. I think it took a solid 4 or 5, if you sort of treat the introduction of C++ in 1985-ish as the first mainstreaming of object-oriented programming, I think it took about 5 years before there were, there was a canonical book that you could go and read on how to go do that, right? And so I'm sort of hopeful that, I don't know if it's next year or the next couple of years, that those sort of patterns start emerging, and we start talking about the 5 or 6 canonical patterns of applications that you build on top of Kubernetes, and you start giving best practices and advice about, that really looks like, you see code reviews or whatever, that topology really looks like a scatter-gather pattern, let's go do that. And I think that's the part of the ecosystem I'm most excited about, because at the end of the day, this is about, my aspiration is that this is about democratizing distributed systems. Right? And that's way more exciting to me than startups or people making money and all that kind of stuff.
One of the things, sorry, I just want to jump in here. One of the things, this is just like a plea to the community. Just like, hey guys, love to see this. I'd love to see a really robust serverless pattern emerge on top of Kubernetes. I think that I think there's a really interesting opportunity there for the community to deliver a very strong and robust event fabric and a really nice lightweight activation model inside the community space.
I think to do that we need a lot of work on formalizing and fleshing out the event system. The event system is extremely ad hoc right now in terms of both how it events and what it chooses to event. And we need something more principled there for that to work.
I just think that'd be awesome. I don't know who's building it, but it'd be cool to see.
So, echoing some of the stuff, I think there's really 2 sets of users broadly, or 2 hats that people wear in Kubernetes. There's administering a cluster and using a cluster. And over time, it's been really fascinating to see those constituencies really evolve and be represented at things like KubeCon. And I think we've gotten to the point where, getting a cluster up and running, it's not as easy as we want it to be, but it's doable. And so, I'm really excited to see everything shift to that second constituency of okay, now that I have a cluster, what the hell do I do with it? Which
but I think also moving beyond, I think also, and you sort of echoed this earlier, moving beyond, I stood up my cluster and there's logging and there's integrated storage and there's monitoring and it's all just sort of I don't think it should be part of the project. I mean, I don't think that
Yeah.
that's core, but I want that recipe to be canonical, right? Like I want that distribution where you get all that
But
stuff.
that's all kind of part of the sort of dial tone of having a cluster.
Exactly. And I think that as we move from it being hard to set up a cluster, we start moving into it now. It's easier to get all of the other stuff that you need to.
So this question's for you, Brendan. The Azure Container Service that was announced today. Can you tell us what they mean by what Microsoft's intent is with Kubernetes?
To make it really easy to run Kubernetes on Azure. How's that?
That's a good PR.
All right. I've been trained well. No, I mean, I think that the ACS has been very transparent. Azure Container Service has been very transparent from the get-go that, you know, it wants to enable people to have a really smooth, easy experience with whatever they choose to use to orchestrate containers on Azure, and it was a natural logic. I mean, we've already been doing in Cole's right over there, he's done a bunch of the work, but we'd already been doing a lot of work to make Kubernetes run really well on Azure, and it was just a natural extension to sort of take it a step further and make it a couple command lines to turn up a cluster.
So now I'm going to open this up for questions out in the audience, if anyone out there has questions.
Should we toss the mic out there?
Yeah,
Just repeat the question.
I'm so not throwing it.
The things that we're missing from Docker, for Kubernetes, there was no mention of. So I was just surprised and wanted to know people's thoughts. There was no mention of how Docker couples the registry service together with the container format. And I was wondering if that omission was, I guess, something that you guys did intentionally or just kind of got omitted by accident during the discussion?
You know, in my mind that, so the question is, in the discussion around Docker, the coupling of the registry service and the image format. I think, you know, when we say that we want an open standardized format and that there are concerns around sort of the monolithic nature of the Docker daemon, I think that really pulls those things together. And so the parts really here are a packaged format, the how do you name containers, right? Because right now there's, you know, Ubuntu has an implied docker.com in front of it, whereas everybody else has to actually list a domain. So how do you name these things? And then how do you sort of upload and download? And really, for distribution like that, a lot of times the upload path and download path should really be pretty separate. I'd love to see the download path be nothing but plain old HTTP, because that's super easy to host. Yeah, I think that's kind of implied when we say open format.
I mean, it's unremarkable. Like there are a lot of coupling points in Docker stack. I mean, if you look at the way that the networking implementation is done, it pulls through deep coupling to the daemon. So I mean, I think you raise a great point, which is, you know, in general, we highly value decoupled stacks with principled interfaces and reasonably consistent sort of, you know, like I hesitate to use the word standards because it creates this incredible like visceral reaction from the community. But the reality is for us to get to this boring technology, a lot of the interfaces need to become standard interfaces, stable interfaces. And we need to make sure that we are fastidiously decoupling pieces. And at the end of the day, you know, I think Docker's erred on the side of the sort of Apple philosophy, which is really about creating a great experience, but requiring a holistic ecosystem. And they haven't really focused on any kind of structured decoupling almost anywhere in the stack. And I think, you know, for the community to really take off, we need to focus on at almost every level, whether it's at the volume interface, at the network interface, at the registry interface, at the runtime interface, you know, like stable interfaces, standard interfaces.
Yeah.
How do you see the role of Kubernetes in persistent storage? And same question for CNCF and persistent storage.
I think persistent storage is critical to actually being useful, and it was, you know, a little easy to neglect it at the beginning. But I think we've got a story that's emerging pretty well now. I came from Sig Storage today, where we had a whopping 30 people sitting in a room to talk about storage all day.
And that is boring.
It is boring. And I mean, these were great. It was vendors, it was enterprise vendors mostly who were there to talk about what their customers need out of a storage stack in Kubernetes. And so it was great. I think we made some good progress on a couple of really hard issues. And I think we're going to continue to evolve that. But I think that it's absolutely critical, and we're paying it a lot more than lip service right now.
So I'll take the other half of that question, which is the CNCF part, which is, I think the other side of the storage thing is that technologies that were built for this world, for the cloud native world, work better in Kubernetes than technologies that weren't, right? And so I think that as we see these technologies get adopted into CNCF, I think it's great to broaden their reach, to make sure they have homes where people can depend on them. I think a lot of the challenges, a lot of the newer storage technologies come up out of open source startups where it's hard to, if you're a company, how do you bet on that thing that could explode, right, in a year? And so I think there's a good reason to bring these companies into a more stable place where they can, they can see the adoption that then helps them in storage be easy in places like Kubernetes.
So so much of Kubernetes design is really guided by Google's experiences. And I think storage is one place where that experience kind of lets us down. Google, until we built out GCE, did not have a block device, a network block device. Everything was essentially object stores with GFS and Colossus. And in the transition from GFS to Colossus, they actually removed features and made everybody in the company just suck it up, right? You can do that when you're a company like Google and you have a lot of engineers and you can actually sort of drive those types of changes. There's no shared file systems. It's
Still
all
took a year and a half.
with that.
It still took like
it was
a year
not
and a half.
fast, but it happened, right? And you can imagine like removing features from a storage stack, is a pretty huge feat, and having the world move forward. So many of Google's storage systems are really non-standard and make the assumption that Google's writing fresh code to those systems. That experience could not be more different, for everything happening outside of Google. And so I think, this is a great place where, the Kubernetes, folks from Google really need to learn and lean on the community.
Well, I guess I'll say the one thing. The one thing I would say is that I think PetSet, formerly known as PetSet, Stateful Set. I think it's a great example of where actually we tacked back, where the community tacked back, where we sort of came out in the beginning and we were like, no, we're not going to do that pattern. That's not a pattern that we like. And eventually enough people said, no, you really, this program and that program needs it, and eventually we tacked back. And I think that's also important, right? It's important that a community can change its mind and can be convinced that it's wrong and make different decisions the second time around.
Hi. So my question would be, when do you think Kubernetes is mature enough to have a book written, Kubernetes in production, including security consideration, admission policies? So Kelsey's working on it.
So some of my
But
co-authors.
I don't only want.
What did you say right after Duke Nukem comes out? Half-Life 3. He's busy playing Half-Life 3.
So there's a Kubernetes up and running book, which I've been accused has become the Duke Nukem of tech books. So I think 60% of the book is done. You can actually, some people have purchased it. Thank you. I bought things with that money. And I've recruited some co-authors. Raise your hand if you've been recruited as a co-author on Kubernetes. Great. So the book will be balanced with some of these core ideas and principles of why Kubernetes and some of the theory behind it. But to keep the book grounded in reality, we want to make sure that all the concepts that we express in the book are something that you can put your hands on the keyboard in the same chapter. So those that are interested in the book, Kubernetes Up and Running, really talk from my experience from configuration management into the world of Kubernetes and what that world looks like. But I think my co-authors up there would add a lot of color about the ideas that Google had and their experiences into Kubernetes from an open standpoint. So it's coming, and now will be 3 people to blame, and it will happen.
Oh, over there. Oh, no, sorry.
Very good. This gentleman over here has been waiting a while, so he should be next. But no, after this.
No, after this.
Sorry.
So you guys mentioned a few things being in core and the idea of third-party things. I'm curious where you think multi-tenancy falls in that group.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, well, I mean, we talked about pluggability, and I think Dawn's here, so she probably knows the real state of affairs. But like, one of the good things here is extracting the container runtime out, right? And so that we can have a secure multi-tenant container runtime, which we don't have right now, in a pluggable way. So if you want to bring that into your cluster, you can bring that into your cluster. I think otherwise at the API level, we are working very hard to ensure that the API itself is secure and multi-tenant. So I think that's what I would ask.
So, I mean, my comment here is that multi-tenancy means different things to different folks. There's the Google model of multi-tenancy is what I would call soft multi-tenancy. If somebody's doing something bad, you call them up and tell them to stop. If they don't, you fire them. There's a certain amount of consistency, in terms of like, well, you want a whole bunch of namespaces all on the same network, right? There's other models of multi-tenancy where you want higher and harder walls, where you want more separation, more customization. Right now, third-party resources, when you install them, they're usable by every namespace in the cluster, right? That works in the sort of Google model of multi-tenancy, but not necessarily in this sort of hard, invite state actors to attack you level of multi-tenancy.
So I think in order to achieve multi-tenancy, and I agree completely with Joe that there are many levels of multi-tenancy. In fact, I don't think it's a stack. I think it's a multi-dimensional problem. I think we're going to need some constructs in the core in order to achieve multi-tenancy, but I do not believe that the core pieces that actually are multi-tenant usable are going to be part of the core. So I think we'll need things like network awareness for multi-tenancy. I think we'll need more concepts of identity and authorization in the core system. We're accumulating these features now, but then we will have the primitives on which people can build whatever their definition of multi-tenancy really needs to be.
And I think, and we've seen this again and again with Kubernetes, is that we end up with a whole bunch of building blocks, but there isn't a lot of best practices on how to put these things together in a sane way. And so that's some of the maturity that I think we're going to have to continue to develop as a community, to actually like, okay, you could do it that way, but really sort of here's a good standard way to actually put all these things together in a sane way that people have been shown can work.
Just curious what components in Kubernetes you feel are the most error-prone or need the most work, not including documentation and API objects.
Everything I wrote.
Everything Brandon wrote.
He's not even kidding, is the thing.
It takes many different archetypes to build a product like this.
That's true.
I'm very close. I think everybody here is close to some of the components more than the other components. So from my end, of course, I see all of the places where storage has blips and goes wrong and drops a byte. I see all the places where networking is too hard to configure or make some assumption that is sort of dubious when you put it out in front of some other users. I don't think there's any one component that is glaringly over error prone. But I think that if you asked, each of the Kubernetes maintainers, they'd all probably pick their own.
What's your pet one?
My pet error-prone subsystem? Yeah. Probably storage, because I came from Sig Storage today, where we went through a whole bunch of corner cases that I bet that doesn't work.
Right, Brendan, what's your pet thing that you could be, change one thing?
If I could change,
if I
could change one thing,
or
cloud provider.
It's not. No, actually, I don't actually care about cloud provider. Like everyone, I wrote that interface. Everybody hates it, but I don't mind that interface. One of the things I think is interesting along the storage lines that we've discovered repeatedly, I think, is that almost none of these storage technologies were built to be mounted and unmounted repeatedly, I think. Like, none of the cloud providers building VMs thought, geez, somebody's going to just like mount and unmount every 10 minutes. Or even the kernel, I think, didn't think this was going to happen.
They're built for human speed, not automation.
That was interesting. I think that I don't know if it's error prone exactly, but every time I go anywhere near the API conversion code, I want to shoot myself. Right? Like, it's error prone for me because it's hard. Like, yeah, man, it's hard to know what it might be through. It's our problem though, so
Do you have one, Craig?
I mean, I'd love to see the installation experience better. I'm a relatively novice user, and I like that part of my brain that does engineering. They cut it out a long time ago, and it's just too hard to get it up and running in other environments. So I'd love to see better installation scripts.
So I'll tell you, the thing I'm horrified about is that we're still writing these like YAML manifests by hand. Those things are incredibly verbose. I always thought that they were, verbose because they were going to be machine generated and machine read. And here we are still writing by hand. So I think we need to get a handle on that.
Well, if there's no more questions, thank you guys for coming out tonight.
Thank you.